Right, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Jurée Capers, who is an associate professor in the Department of Public Management and Policy at Georgia State University. Jurée is my colleague. I'm very excited for this conversation today. Her research focuses on social and racial equity at the intersection of public administration, policy implementation, and race and ethnic politics. She also studies the policy implications of ethnic diversity and bias within racial groups. So, welcome, Jurée.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction.
So I'm just going to jump into our first question that my student submitted, and it's a little bit of sort of a provocative question. So I'm excited to start with it. So this student asks, "It's no secret that minority groups in this country have a tougher time breaking out of poverty. However, the student struggles with the chicken or egg first nature of societal struggles. Do you think that racial ethnic background plays into economic hardship, or do you think that economic hardships keeps minorities from breaking out of difficult situations?"
That is an excellent question. And I don't know if I'll be able to disentangle the chicken or egg part of this for you, but let me help you sort of think about this in the way that we talk about it in social policy. So, one of the first things that I often share with my students in social policy is that even the things that we think are behavioral explanations for income inequality and poverty, such as the type of job that a person holds or one's level of education, can all be tied back to structural factors like public policy. And so that suggests that, income inequality and poverty for people of color in this country can be tied to policy. And so that economic inequality, yeah, it could be that people of color have lower levels of education, they are more likely to work in helping sectors or the service industry. But the reasons that that is the case is historically because of policy decisions that have been made in this country that have created that type of economic hardship and income inequality. And so this means that, yes, some of it is behavioral, but even those behavioral things that people sometimes contribute to the plight of people of color in the US is still a policy issue. And so that often leads me in my research um, to lean more toward the fact that economic hardship is happening because people of color in the country are often left out or not thought about in policy decisions. And historically, we have had policy decisions that have explicitly excluded them.
Thank you so much, Jurée. That's really fantastic. And like you said, sort of the systemic nature of these issues makes it hard to figure this out. So the next question, Jury, we have from our students is, what changes have you found in your research in regard to social and racial equity due to the recent political climate? So we've had the election year, the Black Lives Matter protest, other protests. So how does that sort of impact, all the discussion and progress on social and racial equity?
Good question. So, I feel a challenge here because if I had to be completely transparent, I have not done the research that I need to be doing this semester with our new transition to online education. However, what I have learned and realized this summer and from the election and just all of the changes that we've experienced in 2020 is that people are paying more attention to systemic racism, income inequality, racial injustice, and racial equity and social equity. And so that has brought me great joy in the type of research that I do. And I've realized and seen more people using some of the terminology that for a long time was just used amongst people in academy, right? Professors, thinkers, maybe sometimes people, news reporters, people who kind of care about these issues, but see it as has been seen as a niche issue, has become really more mainstream. And so that has been very encouraging and has certainly made me very hungry to get back into the research mode. One of the things, though, that has really come to light in this year related to my research and that has really brought some attention to the work that I do is this focus on young women and Black girls in and police brutality. And so I do some work with a colleague at the University of Kansas looking at the long-term implications of school disciplinary policies on Black girls. And for a long time, we've talked about discipline disproportionality and how Black boys are often subject to harsh disciplinary actions for subjective things that other students may not experience. But women, girls have been left out of this conversation. But with the movement of Say Her Name and the death of Breonna Taylor and people just remembering about Sandra Bland a few years ago and countless other women um, who have been who've lost their lives to police brutality has brought this further attention on the plight of Black girls and women of color in the criminal justice system. And so that work has certainly gained some traction, and there's a lot more discussion, and that's helped us a little bit too, because we've been able to use some of the recent discussions to say, yeah, we're talking about it, but empirically we don't really know what is happening and what this means for young girls. So for our work, we are excited to share, hopefully very soon, some research that shows that when a Black girl is disciplined or suspended just one time, she's 3 times more likely to have to rely on public assistance in the future. And so what that means is that even though she may avoid incarceration like a Black boy, she is pushed sort of into what we consider another carceral institution. So the sanctions of our social welfare system also mimic, in a sense, our criminal justice system. That is to say, people are surveillance, right? So you have to report to a caseworker, right? They may show up to your house to check who lives there, to make sure that people who aren't supposed to be living there to live there. For example. And so there is a lot of monitoring and surveillance, and you are sanctioned sometimes if you do not appropriately report your use or your earnings. And so there's a lot that aligns with the way that we facilitate our social welfare system with our criminal justice system. And so we see the two kind of in a synonymous sense. And so that this new focus on Black girls with Breonna Taylor has allowed us to say, hey, look at what's happening here in schools.
That's fantastic. And I love how topical sort of some of the questions you're asking in your own research are. And I can't wait to read sort of what you come up with in the course of time. So the next question is really, alive in the media and in politics right now is the question on minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that there's been a lot of sort of discussion around minimum wage and a lot of sort of progress to 2 step forward and then sort of 1 step back. And so just based on your research and your teaching in this field, what are some of the reflections that you have right now on minimum wage and what's happening just currently?
Yeah, I am fascinated with the current discussion and debate at the moment about increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So a few things about this. So the first thing is that, we haven't seen an increase in minimum wage since 2009 when we moved it to $7.25. But we know that the cost of living in almost every city has increased since 2009, right? And certainly. And so $7.25 doesn't go as far. And so being able to see a debate and a discussion about increasing it has been really fascinating to me. But seeing some of the pushback is also very interesting too, as we see the federal government having to provide more and more public service and social relief to the public. And so one notion and thought is like, if we increase the minimum wage, then we should see a lower need for greater federal assistance. That is to say, we probably won't need as much money dedicated to cash benefits for people who are in need, or for food assistance for people in need, or for housing assistance, for example. And so increasing the minimum wage should allow and help and assist with that. But at the same time, for myself, I have wondered and questioned, and I have to do a little bit more reading on this to see, well, where do we get this $15 number from, right? Is that enough? So one of the activities I love to do in my social policy course with my students is for us to figure out what does it actually take to live in Atlanta. And so what we do is we go through an activity and we just throw out some numbers and say, okay, this is what I think, this is what I pay for rent, right? This is how much I think I spend in gas. This is how much I spend in food. Oh, well, I have to have some insurance. And then we, as a class, quickly go through and try to Google what the actual numbers are. And often we realize, like, wow, many of us don't have enough to actually live in the way that we think we should live in the city of Atlanta. And so what that means is that this $15 an hour number might not even be sufficient, right? That means that while it may be a minimum, which is a floor wage, means the baseline, the bottom of the wage scale, it still might not be a living wage. And so this will mean that we will have to continue this discussion. We'll likely continue the discussion even if in the next 4 years the Biden administration is able to get a $15 minimum wage. And so for some companies, this isn't going to be a problem. So people who work at Costco, for example, have long earned more than $15. And so we know that this can work. And there are other companies that we do realize, some maybe mom and pop shops that are not going to be able to manage that. And so there are a lot of factors to think about. And so this is what makes this debate really fascinating for me. And I can't wait to see what direction it goes.
Yeah, and how you mentioned Costco, it reminds me also sort of how this notion of minimum wage can be actually a smokescreen for companies to say, hey, we are providing minimum wage, but look at Amazon. I think it was 2 years ago they declared minimum wage, but Amazon workers have got to be the most sort of vulnerable right now in terms of their working conditions. So I think it can also be a, disadvantage the way the narrative is being crafted as if it's the gold standard of what a company should do.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very, very good point. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and also you talked about pushback, and another pushback is also in terms of the demographics of who gets minimum wage, right? So, it's always considered as like teenagers or college students who are doing these kind of jobs, and it's not a long-term, employment. And I don't know if you have any reactions to that in terms of sort of what you see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So that's a common misconception, is that the typical minimum wage worker is a high school student working at McDonald's, but that's really not the case. The typical minimum wage worker is a woman, a mother, likely a mother of color. And so this means that back to the very first question that we started with, these are policy decisions, right, that are creating economic inequality and economic hardships for people. This is a policy decision right now suggesting that, well, we could pay these people more, but it may have bigger implications for our business, or just political reasons for pushing back. And so this is really a common misconception that it's a child or a student. It's really an adult who is trying to support a family that's typically working on minimum wage. That's a very good point.
Yeah, and again, sort of putting the responsibility on the individual versus sort of thinking about policy. So I love how you bring it back to sort of these structural policy issues. Thank you for doing that. So the next question is, I think, right up your expertise around, I know your research is around organizational structure of public agency and, other such actors. So this student is asking how, if at all, can the organizational structure of a particular public agency affect the execution of policy meant to address social and racial inequity?
Yeah. So when I think about and talk about organizational structure, there are a few things that I often look at. And it's first the design of the structure. So does the agency allow the people who work in that agency a lot of discretion to implement policy sort of free? Not to say they're just freewheeling and dealing. That's not what I mean. But with their own insight and understanding and knowledge to implement policies. So allowing them to do a little bit of innovation and creativity. And the other thing that I often look at is sort of who's in the agency, the type of representation in that agency. And those things are really important to understand how an agency is going to implement policies. And so I think if we think about this at the federal level and the type of work that I do, um, the Department of Education under Secretary DeVos, in the last administration, the structure of that agency, that is the people who work there, the type of discretion that they had to carry out policies that were focused on gender issues such as Title IX, or racial issues such as discipline disproportionality and the racial gap in discipline policies in schools, was very different from what we experienced under the Obama administration under the last Secretary of Education, Secretary King. And so that structure under Secretary DeVos really shaped how they moved, how they interacted, who worked there, and what policy goals they sought. And the level of racial equity that we experienced under the DeVos administration wasn't as strong as what we experienced under the Obama administration. We saw this in some areas, as well, in terms of how the Department of Justice carried out some of its policies as well. So I think for me and the type of work that I do is often looking at who works here and how are they able to work here to figure out what type of outcomes are we going to experience and receive, and are those things going to be racially equitable?
So, are there particular kinds of structure that are more conducive to a more equitable policy?
Yeah, so and usually, so I tend to do research in education, and so this means that a lot of the work that I do is at the school district level, so at the local government level. And when you do work at the local government level, I find it very rewarding because it's closer to the people and compared to the federal government. And so exploring sort of those structures that are a little more, I'll say, not so top, so not so far removed from what's happening at the local level, I find to be a more amenable structure to racial equity. And so that's why for me, school districts and understanding schools has been very fruitful. I would also say agencies that are structured in a way that allow some level of what we consider decentralization. So maybe not such a rigid hierarchical structure where there's like a one big boss and everybody has to listen to that boss, but a structure that's more decentralized where people are able to sort of voice their opinions, bring in their expertise. They don't necessarily have to check in with leadership or get strong approval or buy-in from leadership, but they have some flexibility to do a little bit of creativity on their own, has seemed to be more helpful for racial equity issues.
That's great. And as you know, some of my research is in sort of organizational or and management area, and so I also resonate with what you're describing as who works there. So we sort of bring our logics into the organization in terms of experience, our education, and so on and so forth. So do you see any of that in terms of? Do you see any patterns in terms of certain kind of leaders and agents sort of more.
Yeah, yeah. So a big strand of my work looks at representation in agencies, and when I do that type of work, I'm looking to see if an agency is racially reflective to the greatest extent possible of the clients being served. And so I'm often looking at how many Black teachers or Latinx teachers or Asian American teachers or white teachers or multiracial teachers are in a school district, and will that level of diversity and mix in that school mean that students get better outcomes? Will students perform better when they are matched with a teacher that shares their race or their gender? Will they be recommended more for gifted education classes if they share the race of their teacher? Are they less likely to be sent to the principal's office and maybe get a warning when they act out of character when they share the race of their teacher? And so that work allows me to sort of think about that type of structure, like who works here. And if those teachers, especially when they're dealing with students who share their racial or ethnic or gender identity, are more likely to resonate or relate with those students. And you bring in that experience and that background and that shared identity in a way that is helpful for the student. In the same sense, I tend to also ask, like, well, what does that mean when a student isn't matched with a teacher? What are the implications for that? And in education, this has become a really big question because we realize that our student population in the US has become increasingly diverse. In fact, children that are under the age of 9, there are more students of color under the age of 9 than white students. And so this means that in the average school, more and more teachers are going to be teaching more students of color, but our teaching staff is mostly more female and more white. And so we're going to see, if we don't sort of address this, we're going to continue to see greater levels of mismatch than we even currently see. And so it leaves open the question, okay, what's going to happen in schools if match is important? And that doesn't mean that a teacher who doesn't share your race can't positively affect you. But what the research shows is that there is an added benefit to having a teacher that shares your racial identity. And so it does leave once a question, like, what is this going to mean in the future if we don't improve the diversity of our agencies and improve that type of organizational structure factor?
That's fantastic. Yeah, so important. I think so. Being an immigrant myself, I can relate to so much of what you're saying, that there is sort of all these subtleties and intuition and so on and so forth that, certain having lived a certain life brings with it. So that's amazing that you're finding that in your research. So I also know that some of your research is based around, this idea of heterogeneity in minority groups. And so because sometimes when we think about minority groups, we think of this, monolithic, apply the same policy to everyone. But you find in your research that there is actually a lot of variance and heterogeneity within the group. And so tell us a little bit about that. What have you been finding? Any implications you can think in terms of social equity, racial equity, and policies of social welfare?
Yeah, awesome. So again, the work that I do in that area, of course, is based in education. And so the research that I've looked at is really about ethnic group differences within racial groups. And so this research focuses on trying to understand if not sharing the ethnic background of a bureaucrat, of your teacher, for example, is going to have implications for how you perform in class. So essentially, we realize, for example, the case that I study is on Black immigrants and US born Black teachers. So we know there is a lot of heterogeneity in the Black community, even if it doesn't look like it, right? It doesn't maybe not look like it, but there's so much heterogeneity. There are people from all over the world that are considered Black in the US. But that doesn't mean that all the people are the same, or they have the same experiences, or they have the same ideas and preferences, or that they even identify in the same way as Black. And so for me, that led me to question, well, what will this heterogeneity mean if we think that the people that having a match with your teacher is important? And so, because that means that there's kind of a match there, but there are some differences. So not really. And what the research suggests so far is that thankfully, even when a Black immigrant student has a US born Black teacher, that student is still likely to perform well. And so that means that for this research, having an ethnic difference doesn't lead to a negative relationship, doesn't lead to a negative outcome. So even though there may be differences in that group and there's some heterogeneity, the benefits of having a teacher who shares your race, even if they don't share your ethnicity, is a good thing. And so that's very helpful. But it does lead me and my colleague to think, all right, is this an education effect? And would we see this if we say we take this question to a health agency, or we took this to criminal justice, or we took this question to public welfare? And so that's sort of the direction that we're taking this study now, to figure out maybe it's just education. After all, in education, there are major consequences to students not performing well. And so we might just be really picking up on that. And so I think for moving this forward, it will be really interesting to know what happens and how people are picking up on this heterogeneity. But outside of my research, we've used and looked at this question in terms of class heterogeneity, and I think that might guide us in our next step as well. And so in social policy, the research is often focused on trying to figure out how do we help people of different class statuses, right? Even if they share the same racial background. And so there was years ago a great book that I love using in my social policy class called The Truly Disadvantaged by William Julius Wilson. And in that book, he talks about, he's a little critical of the civil rights policies of the 1960s and the affirmative action programs that came out of that in the 1970s, in some of the 80s. And what he says is like, these policies were helpful for Black people, but a certain group of Black people, right? So he's picking up on the heterogeneity within this group. He says, you know, civil rights policies remove the barriers to economic success for Black people who were already college educated, who were already trained in certain skills, who were almost at the cusp of success. And all they needed essentially was discrimination to be removed, and they were able to move on. But for people who really needed the assistance through civil rights policies, who were really being excluded, who were who were behind, which he called the truly disadvantaged, they did not get the benefit of those policies. And so while on one hand, we tend to think of the civil rights policies as a success, he says a success for who? They weren't a success for, they were success for successful Black people who were already properly going to be successful. And so this makes us think about the class heterogeneity of this population. I think we could say the same for the Latinx community, Asian American community as well. We see these class differences that even though we have policies that are very group oriented, they don't always touch the entire group. And so what that means is that when policymakers are coming up with policies, that they have to really think about, okay, who is my target population and what am I trying to do with this policy? And that's essentially what he tries to get at there, is to say, no one paid attention to the fact that not every Black person was actually poor. And so this means that you really left the poor people without any assistance.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And thank you for suggesting that book. It just sounds fascinating. And I'm also sort of thinking about, you said one implication about more nuance in thinking about who is this policy for. Kind of like in business, you understand your customer as much as you can understand and segment, you're able to cater to the customer. But I also wonder about like the efficiency trade-offs, right? So because, when we think about public policy, it is a blanket sort of, instrument that you're applying. So inevitably, some people will be in, some people will be out, which shouldn't be in and out. So the more nuanced you get, what are the efficiency implications for that?
Yeah, so in full transparency, in the sense that kind of ticking away and coming up with policies that are more specialized or customized for different groups does not read efficient. But I think in the long term, the cost of inefficient policies that don't incorporate people, are inefficient anyway, right? And so thinking about the long-term implications of taking the time to come up with, think about the nuance, does make the long-term implications of a policy efficient, right? And so it makes me think about going back to our debate and question about, well, what if we expand the minimum wage, what will this mean? Well, we could think about taking that question and thinking about all of the populations that are affected and how they're affected, and maybe do something differently. And in the long term, that means that we're going to hopefully come up with a policy that means we have to provide less in public resources and public welfare. And so on the surface and on its face, and maybe in the process, it might not be so efficient, but it is my belief that, over time and in the long run, it should be more efficient overall in the aggregate.
Yeah, and you know, something we have been discussing in sort of the first half of the course is efficiency is just one of the several metrics that a policymaker should be thinking of. So it's equity, you know, it's effectiveness, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a little bit also changing the narrative around, you know, how do you measure success of a policy?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you all are talking about that because people often think of them as trade-offs, but I think overall, if we are having equitable policies and effective policies, right, those should be things that we consider as being more efficient. And so, last, I think book I'll bring up from social policy is this book called The Policy Paradox, and in that book by Deborah Stone, she talks about efficiency as one of these pillars of public policy that she argues probably shouldn't be an outcome or a goal of public policy because policy is supposed to serve the public. And sometimes efficiency means that we're looking for the best outcome with the minimum input. And policy actually needs a good bit of input, right? And so
Yeah.
she is a bit critical of that.
Yeah, no, and it totally makes sense. And again, sort of going back to the world I know the best, even the idea of efficiency is even being questioned in business right now, given the pandemic, right? So there is sort of no degrees of freedom to really, you know, make any changes. So it's really interesting, this idea of efficiency and how ingrained it is in our decision making and
Yes.
thinking. Mm. So the last question is a little bit of, you know, side changing directions a little bit, but it is still very much aligned with your research. Um, so so the student is asking, in terms of providing equitable and effective education to all students, do you think standardized testing is a useful tool, or can it detract from that goal? And maybe you can also, just to keep the flow of our sort of conversation, maybe you can also talk about the policy implications of that.
Yeah. So is it an effective tool? So, yes and no. On one hand, let me explain. The No Child Left Behind really sped up our focus and emphasis on standardized testing. And No Child Left Behind is criticized, debated, but one thing that No Child Left Behind did was take the blinders off and reveal to us inequalities and despair in school performance and student performance. Before No Child Left Behind and focusing on tests, we did not know that, for example, children with disabilities were performing at a lower rate than everyone else, right? Those numbers and those scores were all being sort of collected at the aggregate and maybe not shared in a way that was widespread. So maybe the school knew, maybe even the school district knew, but sometimes parents didn't know that. They just knew that their child went to a good school, right? And that good school was subjective. That might have meant that one sector of students were doing well, where a whole nother sector of students were not, hence the left behind, right? And so what No Child Left Behind did with those standardized tests is allow us to see which segments of the population were not doing well, and it held schools accountable for making sure that all different types of students were performing at a level. Before we didn't know. So we might have suspected, right, that students of color were performing at a lower level than their white peers, but we didn't know that. We might have suspected that girls were doing one thing and boys were doing something else, but we didn't know that. And so that was the benefit of standardized tests under No Child Left Behind. It certainly took the blinders off and gave us some clear evidence of these racial disparities in education. Um, so that's one thing. And the second thing I will point out is while it did do that, the accountability part of it became very stressful for schools. And so that's where the unintended consequence of this policy decision happened. And the unintended consequence of those standardized tests was so much attention was placed on performing, not necessarily always teaching, but getting that performance outcome and improving those numbers, that it actually hurt students in the process. And so that positive thing that No Child Left Behind did, revealing these disparities, also was the thing that harmed the students and created more pressure and more issues for students of color in particular. And so this is why I say yes and no, because it did certainly give us some information we didn't have before, but it did also create inequalities and create an additional level of pressure, unchecked processes and decisions from leaders to try to make grades happen, maybe not in the most ethical way. And that was not very helpful for children. And so this will, as I talk about this, hopefully this will make you realize that for every policy that we come up with, sometimes we don't always think about the unintended consequences of policy. And so one of the things I often encourage students to do when they're making policy recommendations and proposals is to say, okay, what could happen? What are the bad things that could happen from your policy recommendation? And it's not the thing that we're comfortable thinking and saying, because we like to think that all of our policy ideas are awesome and amazing and they're going to save the world and solve the problems. But there are also often unintended consequences. And so thinking about that means that we can try to do our best to minimize that. And I think that's one of the things that really led to the downfall of No Child Left Behind.
That's fantastic and so important to critically think about what can go wrong. So if you were to advise, on the Secretary of Education, what would be an idea that can take some of the good things from No Child Left Behind, but address some of these downfalls?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Every Child Succeeds Act, which was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, basically, long way of saying it was the latest version of No Child Left Behind, created under the Obama administration. And one of the things that it did was try to take some elements of No Child Left Behind that were helpful, so still encouraging states and school districts to have standardized tests, to report that information, to track disparities, but it tried to relax some of the accountability things, and it also tried to give states more guidance on how to hold themselves accountable. So another thing that went wrong there was states were given the flexibility to come up with their accountability systems, but they were also the people regulating their accountability. So I don't know about you guys, but it's sort of like when your mom says, do your homework, and you check, and you also check your homework, mom checking your homework. She asks you like, yeah, I did it because you checked it, right? Even if you didn't do it. So that was happening in a lot of states. And so the federal government began under President Obama, and President Trump kept this part for the most part, as well as to say, hey, here are some guidelines on how we would like you to hold yourselves accountable. And that was sort of their way of saying, accountability is important, but we need to do this in a better way. And that administration also provided some more support for states to assess themselves better. And so one of the big critiques was there wasn't enough support for all financial support from the federal government for all of the things that it wanted states and school districts to do. And so those were some things that happened in the Obama administration to try to pick up the pieces. And so for the Biden administration, right, for the new Secretary of Education, I would encourage him to, maintain those things, but also to do more outreach and support. So I think that one of the things that state and local governments realize is like, you're telling us what to do, but you're not being our cheerleader and supporting us as well. It felt very top down at some point. And so states need sort of that communication and more collaborative approach, which is kind of the direction that government is going in anyway, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, and also, so we did discuss the No Child Left Behind in a couple of weeks ago. So one of the things that was also sort of a mismatch was the incentives or the rewards were only for the outcome and not for the process. And maybe that's where you're going in terms of providing financial support for the process and not just sort of hitting these numbers. So yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. Jurée, that's what I had. Anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to share?
No, I don't think so. This was great. Hopefully you all get a lot from it. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions and this challenge to get back on my research and get in the game.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your insights. I think you're doing such important research, and your students are fortunate to sort of be able to receive those kind of experience and inputs from you. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.